Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum salam.
This is MTA International USA Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland. My name is Ahmad Khan, and I will be moderating today's discussion on Islam Ahmadiyya in America. Our esteemed panelists today are Brother Al-Haj Habeeb Shafeeq of Orlando and Brother Al-Haj Yaqub of Milwaukee. Brother Al-Haj Habeeb served in the education industry as social services professional, social services consultant. He acquired his master's in public administration. He worked in city government planning, special projects planning. He's a traveler. He's visited Mecca, Medina, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, UK, Ghana. His passion is community service and education. In his off time, he loves to cook and garden. Brother Al-Haj Yaqub served in the military during the Vietnam era. He served as the executive management of proprietary schools, worked in the nonprofit for 10 years, quality control in the American Society of Mechanical Engineers as a code inspector. He's a writer, a thinker, and a scholar. And today's episode, and we're going to discuss today's episode as the pre-Columbus presence of Islam in America. My first question is going to be to Brother Shafeeq. There are many people who have researched pre-Columbus Islam. For instance, Ivan Van Sertima. Why is it that he is discredited by some of the researchers that he has published, the research that he has published on this issue? And I want to point out some, not every person.
Brother Ahmed, thank you. Jazakumullah for having me here with this fabulous MTA team here in USA. The short answer is he did this research with due diligence, but he done it from an Afrocentric perspective. And in my opinion, that perspective is not appreciated by European scholars and not appreciated not only in history, but in other fields as well.
I mean, there are many scholars in this field, not just Ivan Van Sertima. In fact, the two scholars that he worked off of was Leo Weiner,
yes, Alexander
von Wathnow.
Yes.
So it's not like he acquired this research from some place or that's unknown. It was already some established research out there.
And as I mentioned, he did due diligence, and they have no argument at all with the methodology or the empirical things that he founded. It's that he done it from an Afrocentric lens, and from that lens and that history, I think it's difficult for those scholars to accept.
So it might not have been in their European interest to discuss a person, even though he has stature.
It's never in the interest of those individuals who are being identified as either the oppressor or somehow being culpable in a particular thing. It's never in their best interest to, how can I say it, to give credit to the history from the perspective of those individuals who are actually being targeted or victimized by that history.
Which is why we call it bias.
Which is why we call it bias in the first place.
I want to address the next question to Brother Yaqub.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. And when we try to go back, and we are trying to research in the New World Islam, how far do we go back according to the scholars? And who are these Muslim explorers?
Well, the main explorer was Mensa Abu Bakr II, and he was, Mensa actually means king, and he was the king of Mali, or the Malian Empire. And in 1310 AD, he sanctioned an expedition of between 200 and 400 ships to sail west. And those ships, out of those 200 or 400 ships, there was only one that came back.
So mind you, even though the one that came back, this was almost like a one-way trip for most of the people who left for this expedition.
Exactly. Now, he wasn't deterred at that point. He again put together an expedition of 2,000 ships. He left, when I say left, meaning that he turned his kingdom over to his brother, and he left and never returned. So we know that he set up this expedition of 2,000 ships, and from there we know that they set up trading partnerships with the Native Americans, and
it's not just this vast planning that was done and these explorers went out there. We also have motivation from, I'll read you in gist of what the second Khalifa said about, he said that there was a group of designated at the time of Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu anhu to sail the New World to basically the Americas, and they never returned either. So even we have internal motivation as Ahmadi Muslims as well.
Exactly.
I want to go on the evidence now. So my question to Haji Yaqub Saab is, what kind of evidence can we look at when we are trying to confirm the arrival of Islam before Columbus? Is there some area that we can concentrate on and focus?
Archaeology, of course, and there's documented evidence exists that the expedition of 1312 landed in the coast of Brazil, and it predates the voyages of Columbus by 180 years. And Columbus' later voyages that he had, they found mosque when Columbus landed in what we now call Cuba, and that there were mosques that were already that he saw, as well as if we do a chemical analysis of the findings of some spears, that the techniques were the same techniques that they were using in West Africa.
The gold tips of the spears.
The gold tips of the spears, yes.
And it's something that's probably a technology that was used in the West African area.
African, right.
And this is concurred by other scholars as well, that gold and how to process everything was done in that time frame for these people.
Right.
And you know, sometimes the evidence is not where you think it is. It's somewhere out there.
Yes.
And it's interesting to note that in 1178, a Chinese document, and this is according to the book by Sultan Abdul Latif, When Nations Gather.
Yes. Which is an Ahmadi brother, by the way.
Exactly. And he talks about this document called the Sung document, or it's pronounced Sung, where Muslim sailors traveling to a land called Mulan Pai, otherwise what we know from the translation is Americas. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that we're studying here. It's evidenced in some other place because of interactions of different civilizations.
That's a good point, yes.
And I want to kind of get into some aspects of Native Americans and Muslim integration. Islam teaches Muslims to not unjustly destroy, conquer, or subjugate, meaning slavery, people.
Absolutely.
And either one of, I would like a comment from both of you on this. Sure. Could this be why Muslim and Native Americans would have integrated due to this kind of teachings within Islam? And I will say, Brother Shafeeq, you can kind of give your perspective on that.
Oh, absolutely. Allah Ta'ala tells us in the Holy Quran that there's not a people whom a warner or messenger has not been sent. And clearly that would apply to the Native American populations as well. And there's so many of them. In my area in Florida, right there on the coast, for an example, down south in Florida, they're cities with Islamic names, and we know that there were Seminole Indians and Seminole natives who lived in those areas. The real issue is that there hasn't been enough scholarship, enough research, or perhaps even enough interest, or perhaps the bias is another way. But clearly Islam teaches that all people had this, and this is not to the exclusion of the Native Americans in the Americas.
Brother Yaqub, what's your perspective on that?
Well, we have to acknowledge that from our perspective, that we want the world to know that Muslims came over to the New World. We were not the first. We're not trying to make that claim. Certainly there were Europeans, explorers who came over here, Eric the Red and so forth. But the Muslims were here, and they landed in what is now Brazil. They did exploration into the Mississippi Delta and went up the Mississippi and integrated all the way up into Canada. So there has been evidence that there were...
and this kind of goes to my second question I was about to ask. What evidence can we look at that would show this integration?
Right. Well, let's take as an example, if we look at the Native Americans, the way that they buried their dead. And we see pictures of poles, and on the top, they had their deceased on the top. Well, as a result of integrating with the Muslims, they began to bury their dead underground. And so they have these mounds that were in the Native Americans that were in the Ohio Valley and in Kentucky. So we believe that this was a direct result of the integration with the Muslims and impact. And
we can also look at the language of some of the tribes. In fact, not just language, but writing.
Right.
Kufic scripts that a scholar like Barry Fell, who was a linguist but turned archaeologist, found remnants. A petroglyph of the phrase Masih ibn Maryam, which is a common Quranic phrase. And he also discusses schools throughout Ohio, Indiana, remnants that were showing these scripts as well, petroglyphs. So based on that, it's not a wild-eyed presupposition. It has a lot of backing and evidence that we can look at.
If I may, I visited the Ute Reservation, the Ute, which is a very huge reservation territory in Utah, and this is not just exclusive to the Utes, but they have a custom there where it's called the sweat, and it is a containment. And there's intense heat inside, and the men go in and they create this heat, and they go in with the purpose of rejuvenating. It's an itikaf, and if you think about the word Ramadan, it means burning away. So I noticed when they would, and they invited me, I just didn't get a chance, and maybe I was a little squeamish to do it, but they go inside of this enclosure, no talking, and it's a seclusion, and they create this internal heat, and they want to burn away various things and to get into a different state of spiritual enlightenment. And to me, it was just clearly a parallel with Itikaf Ramadan and that whole thing that we do as Muslims during Ramadan to try to burn away and escape from negative things that we have been, that's been attached to us. I saw a clear parallel with that. That's just an example.
And following not just Islamic culture and script, but also prophecies that are usually discussed in Islam. For instance, a reformer that is going to come. Incan prophecies talk about a person called Pachacuti, and literally translation is transformer of the earth. Mm-hmm. And then the ghost dance movement was built on the entire idea that somebody was going to come in 1890. Mm-hmm. And they were waiting for that.
Right.
So, and not to mention what they were wearing was actually wearing with a crescent
star,
moon,
yes.
and stars, which is a traditionally Islamic symbols. So it's more than just evidence that we could look on rocks or languages or culture.
Yes.
It's also in the prophecies that they were firmly believing in at the time.
Yes.
I want to go into specifically maybe discuss Columbus. Brother B, was he knowledgeable about Islam?
First of all, Columbus, who was an Italian, was in Spain trying to get his expeditions financed. And we already know the history of the Moors in Spain. Clearly, he was very knowledgeable of Islam, but Islam not from just the standpoint of theology, but in Islam there contained a lot of things with respect to science, exploration. There's verses in the Quran that describe ships being shaped like mountains, and our Muslim explorers, these were not just tales or just some things from the ancient times. To them, this was actually blueprints and ways in which they could design ships, and they saw that this was in accord. So clearly, Columbus was knowledgeable of not only Islam, but the technology that the Moors and Muslim explorers used from the Holy Quran.
He used the maps of Al-Idrisi.
As Al-Idrisi, who was a noted geographer. Yes.
Geographer, cartographer,
yes.
And
yes.
and his accounts are also traced by European scholars. So it's no secret that this is a known fact.
Absolutely.
Brother Yaqub, was anything mentioned in his personal account by Columbus that you know of in discussing maybe engagements with Muslims or even just Muslim artifacts?
Well, we know that they tell the story of Columbus sailing over here, and there were 3 ships: the Nina, Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And in that particular period of history, Muslims were leaving Spain. And in terms of Columbus's surrounded himself with technical people that were explorers. And so the captains of 2 of the ships were Muslims. And they were navigators by trade, and so not only did the instrumentation that were used to navigate were developed by Muslims, but the technology of navigation was really owned, and I guess you could say the Muslims had ownership of these type of technology at the time, and he employed them in terms of being able to find their way.
He mentioned in one of his accounts, and this is in October 21st, 1492, he says he's coming across the northeast coast of Cuba.
And he sees the mountain.
And he saw a mosque on the top of a beautiful mountain.
Yes.
This is actually coming from, as referenced from when nations gather.
Yes.
But it's also mentioned in Muslims in America.
Columbus took he was very detailed with respect to his diaries. And this account is very beautifully written by him, that he saw this beautiful mosque. And how would he know that it was a mosque? So he saw this in Spain. He knew exactly the kind of building that it was.
So this came from his pre-existing knowledge of Islam.
From Spain, no doubt.
And
because he was an Italian, absolutely. Yes.
So I would say my final question to Brother Yaqub is, and I want to go back to the bias part of European bias. Why is there such a bias when it comes to discussing even the idea of a pre-Columbian presence of Islam, and specifically concentrating on Islam?
Well, it's not in the best interests of the Europeans to acknowledge that these West African Muslims made any discoveries before the Europeans. The European presents themselves as superior. They were superior in everything that they did. And to acknowledge that these West African Muslims were the ones who discovered Americas does not support the supremacist concept of the European. It's that simple.
And for us, I want to ask Brother Shafeeq.
Yes.
should we put more effort into getting more research to find out more stuff to solidify this argument of a presence of Islam? Would it be beneficial for us as a community?
I think that's a good question. If that research would allow and brings us to our central focus in Islam and Ahmadiyyat, which is bringing people to get a living connection with their Creator, yes, I think it would be very worthwhile. But the fact of the matter is this: even if that is not the case, clearly we have overwhelming evidence at this time that there has been extreme bias with respect to how Muslims, whether they are African Muslims and other Muslims, have been portrayed prior to Columbus. So with or without any further research is there, but
there's definitely benefits to this.
It would definitely be benefits to this, and we correlated not just for academic or scholarship, but correlated with how there were people who actually had a relationship with Islam, and we know by having a relationship with Islam, they were worshiping one God in the Americas. That would be the significant thing.
I just wanted to point out a direct evidence of European bias, which I kind of found interesting.
Yes.
Barry Fowle, who was mentioned as an archaeologist, linguist, he discovered not just Arabic Kufic scripts, he's discovered other scripts in Americas, like the Celtic Olgam script. They acknowledge him to say that he's actually allowed us to delve into the world of the Celtics and maybe a presence in the Celtic culture of America. But when it comes to the Kufic scripts, they just say that he's a pseudo-scientist.
Right.
So there is definitely a written bias in the European scholarship when they look at scholars who wants to pursue this type of work. And I think we can kind of understand that there was definitely a presence in Islam. We can come to that conclusion.
Yes.
And obviously we have the understanding that it will definitely benefit us in the long run of understanding what that culture was and how it came about. Because
And reminding those people, going back and reminding those people that Islam was theirs, and inviting them to go back and look at it and re-embrace it.
Embrace it. In all of this, Brother Yaqub, what's your perspective in talking about this subject with your scholarship and everything? Could you kind of give a brief outline of where are we at now and where we should go in the future?
Well, if you look at the African Americans, it certainly suggests that there was life before slavery. African Americans have a tendency to begin their life as if that life began with them landing on the East Coast and they started life as slaves. It says that there was life before slaves. It begins a legacy.
You're talking about the narrative that's primarily talked about in the mainstream.
Exactly, yeah. But their legacy really began prior to slavery and prior to the Atlantic slave trade. So life began, let's say historically, began with the explorers who came over here as free men, and they were traders and they were professional people of science, and that we have a legacy that goes back long before.
So we have to understand the legacy to understand the present.
Exactly.
Present situation,
right.
And also the beautiful idea of Islam's idea of integration.
Yes.
Right.
The teachings of Islam, and how that could have worked out at that time with the Native Americans and the Muslims.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I assume you feel in the same way, Brother Shafeeq.
Absolutely. Even as you mentioned in some of their customs, if you look at some of their powwows and some of the native dance, even their circumventions around the fire and around that is the exact direction that we do a circuit during the Hajj. And none of these things in my opinion, are coincidental at all. There's a universal principle working here, and that is the unity of Allah to touch all people. And the Prophet ﷺ in Islam has clearly delineated that.
I think we've definitely reached a conclusion in this discussion.
Yes.
And I would like to add to this, and that is that we have to find the roots of where we come from. That's
Yes,
number one.
Indeed.
And with the knowing the history behind this, we have to know that Islam did make an impact on the Americas. It's not a forgotten history. And it's incumbent upon us as Muslims, Ahmadi Muslims,
Yes.
that are representing Islam to make that notified to the world.
Yes.
It's not just a historical perspective,
Yes.
but it will benefit all of the people whose opinions are suppressed as Muslims or who feel that they have a complex of inferiority. Yes, Brother Yaqub.
There's, in terms of being an Ahmadi Muslim, our leadership under Caliphate and our Khalifa, the second Khalifa, he made this statement that I think is worthy enough to share with our audience.
Please do.
He said that the familiarization with history acts as a great stimulant in the progress of nations. A nation that is unacquainted with the historical accounts can never advance towards progress. Knowledge of the circumstances of one's forefathers guides a person to many higher objectives. And with that in mind, being able to acquaint our members as well as our African American brothers and our Native American brothers that Muslims did sail over here.
It will be helpful to them,
Yeah.
and I would definitely agree to that. So this concludes our discussion today on pre-Columbus presence of Islam in America, the first episode of this series of Islam Ahmadiyya in America. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.